Sky News question and answer programme about the war in Ukraine featuring Professor Michael Clarke. Coming up, we'll have a special report as well from the Donbass. An emotional welcome for emergency crews trying to beat the advance of Russian forces were on the front line of the rescue operation.
Where's the tank?
They're going. It's a tank position. The emergency services guy who's showing us around has said basically from that position, if they're firing, they'll be incoming here any second.
And once again, Professor Michael Clarke is going to be with me to answer your questions about the war in Ukraine and its aftershocks around the world. The EU accuses the Kremlin of using food as a weapon of war as aid agencies warn of an impending hunger catastrophe.
Russia is solely responsible for this food crisis, Russia alone, despite the Kremlin's campaign of lies and disinformation.
And defiant in a red dress, a stark reminder of the normality lost in war. A very good evening. Russia has claimed it has occupied large areas of eastern Ukraine after weeks of intense fighting. The Defence Minister, Sergei Shoigu, announced Kremlin forces now have control of 97% of Luhansk in the east. And Moscow's UN ambassador has walked out of the Security Council after the EU accused Russia of using food supplies as a stealth missile against developing countries. Well, despite that, Russian forces have been pushed back in places, allowing President Zelensky to visit the front line in the east last night. Coming up in just a few minutes, Professor Michael Clarke will be answering the questions you've been sending in to us throughout the day. But first, to the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, where President Zelensky's forces are still managing to hold on to some territory in the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, though they have both been described as dead cities. In Soledar, emergency workers are offering civilians safe passage along the so-called road to life. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, is here and sent this report.
This is a desperate hunt to evacuate people from frontline villages that look destined to fall to Russian forces in the coming days. They're just a few miles away. Emergency services have had calls pleading for help from people in the town of Soledar. They're risking their lives looking for the people who want to leave, but they can't find them. Natalia Babenko is the only person left in her apartment block, but she won't go. Natalia, why don't you want to leave?
Понимаєте, у мене такі болячки, і я не хочу бути навязчиві, понимаете, а так, щоб десь китатися там, ото по різним заведенням, я не хочу.
Aren't you scared, though?
Ну вам не страшно, Наталья Афанасьевна, здесь?
Страшно. Ну, і мені страшно. Просто я.
These towns and villages appear deserted, but there are plenty of people still here. The fighting is intense nearby. People call for help, and they just simply don't turn up to be evacuated.
It seems counterintuitive, but the more the danger, the more the bombing, the less people actually want to leave their homes. They prefer to actually stay where they feel at least safe rather than get in this truck and go to another city. It means that they just sort of stay here, but hit bombs all the time.
Едем в другое место, да?
Да. Тут небезопасно.
So what's going on? Where's the tank?
They're going. It's a tank position. The emergency services guy who's showing us around has said basically from that position, if they're firing, they'll be incoming here any second.
The crews gather to discuss the next destination.
Вот это только так, по-другому никак. Возле Кнауфа, который постоянно
Да.
А сейчас? Сейчас нормально, сейчас поедем.
Поехали, не теряем время дальше.
We climb on board their enormous rescue truck. It's a form of armoured personnel carrier. They call it the capsule. It can seat 17 in the back.
Well, we've had to
changed direction because the road that we were travelling down is now seeing direct fire between the Ukrainian and Russian forces. This truck is so big, it is armoured, but it's so big it'll take direct hits, potentially from missiles, which would still destroy it. We weave our way towards that next destination along the Ukrainian lines.
Эвакуироваться есть желающие? Бахмут.
We reach another group cooking outside. There's no water or power anymore.
Первый дом.
I'm not going anywhere, she says. If God wants me to live, I'll be saved. They start arguing if one of them should go before agreeing they won't. The officer warns they're running out of time to change their minds. They're choosing to stay here, underground, in the darkness. There's 23 people, including children. They collect water in buckets. Their radio is their only contact with the outside world. It's miserable, but it is home.
Если мы уедем, мы сюда уже не приедем. И вообще, бомжи.
Nadezhda comes to see us off. She's worried for her sons and for our mothers. She gets more and more upset. It's very sad.
No comments. She's very nervous.
Yeah. But they won't leave. It's crazy. They're very, very upset. It's sad, yeah. It's sad.
В сторону Солидара. Первый населенный пункт будет Поросковеевка.
The crews are already in the midst of the fighting, but they insist that they'll continue to go out day after day until they can't go anymore. And nobody knows when that will be. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, in the Donbass.
Well, now Professor Michael Clarke is here with me, and we have your questions to put to him. And we have some questions concerning that city that Stuart was reporting from. Good to see you again, Michael. And these questions have a direct bearing, I suppose, on that huge artillery bombardment that's taking place, particularly in the east. This one from James, to kick us off. How much of a difference will the rocket systems being sent to Ukrainian forces make on the battlefield? The UK, amongst others, maybe the UK and the United States sending some more long-range weaponry.
Yes, the US is sending this, the M142, as it's called, multiple launch rocket system. We're sending the M270, which is very similar. They take 6 rockets in the case of the American ones, 12 in the case of ours. They have a range of about 50 miles with the rockets. They can also fire a missile, single missile, with 180-mile range, but we're not giving them those. So they can each fire rockets, 50-mile range. That outranges Russian artillery, which would push them back. And most importantly, these are very flexible, extremely accurate, really accurate. And there's no question about it. The Russians haven't got anything like this, nearly as good. They've got the Grad systems, the Smersh systems, very inaccurate, very old. The problem is not how good the system is, it's the numbers we're sending. So the Americans, who own about 630 of these, if you include the Marine Corps, are sending 7. And we, who own 44 of them, according to the British Army, in 2 regiments, are sending 3.
Right.
So at the moment, the Ukrainians are going to get 10. Now, they're getting plenty of ammunition, plenty of rockets to go with them. But it's in the nature of this sort of ground warfare. I'd be very surprised if they get 10 of these systems in a month's time. I'd be very surprised if more than 2 or 3 of them are still operating after another 2 weeks or so.
So in terms of that part of the question, it says, what difference will they make? You say, well, not much, because there's not many of them.
Yeah, a huge difference, a real battlefield-changing difference, because they negate Russia's main advantage, which is artillery. They could negate that. But Alexei Aristov, who was the presidential advisor in Kiev, he said, we need 60. And I think, yeah, you need 60 this month. And you probably need another 60 after that.
Is training personnel to operate them a problem?
Not a problem, but it takes a little bit of time. But they're not difficult systems to operate, by and large. But you do have to know them and get used to them. And as I say, we have two regiments. One is a reserve regiment up in Gateshead, actually, the 101st RA, and the other one is at Lark Hill, which is using them all the time. So we think reservists can do it, and that's not a particular problem. So I don't think that's the issue. The issue is the sheer numbers. Now, in defence of Britain, the 44 that we've got are all being reconditioned at the moment. They're being upgraded, and the upgrades, they're made by Lockheed Martin, American company, and being upgraded in America. So it may be that we don't have that many we can send at the moment, because our 44 are all going to America to be upgraded in batches of whatever, 6 or 8 or something like that. So I suspect we will end up sending a lot more of these, but if the Ukrainians are going to hold out in the Donbass, they need more than 10, and they need them really, really quickly.
Need them now. Mike's next question flows on directly from that. Mike asks this question, which is, why do we keep telling the Russians what weapons we are sending Ukraine? I mean, that's valuable intelligence, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, in a way, the Russians know anyway. They will know, they'll find out. And the purpose of telling people what we're sending is to express support, to show the world that we're taking real measures to encourage the Ukrainians. If we were doing it secretly, people might get rather depressed that nothing was happening. And on the assumption that the Russians will know anyhow, you might as well get the political benefit out of announcing it. Having said that, certain things that the Russians won't know so much about is the amount of cyber help we are probably giving the Ukrainians. I mean, Paul Nakasone, who's the head of US Cyber Command, made an elliptical comment a couple of days ago saying, oh, yes, we've engaged in quite an offensive cyber as well as defensive cyber in pursuit of Ukraine's war. And he didn't say any more than that about it. And same with intelligence sharing. That certain things that the Russians may not know very much about are not being talked about. But, sending NLAWs like that or Javelin systems, the Russians know. So, make a point of saying it, because you're trying to build up the political pressure that the Western world is trying to help Ukraine as much as possible. That's the political message.
OK, and this question flows from that one there. This one from Gary. He says, every time the West ups the ante in terms of weapons supply, Moscow ramps up its threats. Is there a point of no return potentially sparking World War III? Just in terms of ramping up its threats, Putin did say, didn't he, the other day, after the announcement of these rocket and long-range systems, that they will strike areas not been struck before, and then there were a couple of strikes, weren't there, over the weekend in Kiev?
Yes, and I mean, what Putin is saying, I mean, the only thing that's really consistent about Putin is his brutality. And in a way, what he's saying is, if you send more weapons, we'll kill more civilians. We'll target more civilian areas, and it'll be your fault. The point is that the Russians make these dark threats, and they never specify really what they are. They always think. Modern Russians always still think in rather Marxist-Leninist terms. So they always talk about structures and world forces and dynamics of history and so on. And so they say that if, for instance, Finland and Sweden join NATO, it will alter the balance of European structures and we must take corresponding action. And they never say what that is. But then they actually conduct a couple of nuclear drills around the Baltic, and they say we might have to put nuclear weapons in the Baltic. Well, you've already done that, thank you. You've got Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad, which are nuclear capable. So you did that in 2018. What's new? And in a way, there's not much the Russians can do. They can make these threats, and these threats are meant to be frightening, and by and large, they're not, because the Russians are at full stretch at the moment. Unless they take warfare to a new level, which they could, or they mobilise nationally, which they could. At the moment, they haven't done either of those things. So at the moment, all they can do is make these dark threats, which, to be honest, the Western Europeans and the United States are not really too bothered about.
But the second part of the question, is there a point of no return potentially sparking World War III? Is there a point at which Russia could decide that it will attack beyond Ukraine's border, especially with this weaponry that's being delivered to them? It's been marshalled, one imagines, in places like Poland and Romania and wherever.
Yeah. Well, that would be a big step. I mean, if the Russians targeted these weapons coming in Poland or in somewhere else, or at sea when they're on their way, then that would be tantamount to a declaration of war on NATO. And then we're into Article 5 territory, and then we're talking about not necessarily World War III, but a European conflict that would involve NATO on one side and Russia on the other. I think we're a long way from that, because if that actually happened, the Russians would lose badly. I mean, NATO is far, far stronger in warfare terms than Russia is, but we can't deny the fact that this crisis is getting more dangerous all the time. I mean, I've been saying this for weeks, that escalation is built into the dynamics of this crisis, and it will get more dangerous, and we will have to keep our nerve as we go through this.
But at the moment, you say Russia hasn't mobilised and Russia is concentrating all or most of its firepower now in the east and a specific area of the east as well, because, as we've been reporting earlier, the Ukrainians are making some advances in places in the south and the east.
Yeah, and they're pushing in the Donbass. I mean, you know, the Russians have got 20% of Ukraine's territory. In 2014 and now, altogether, they've grabbed 20% of the territory. And you can see why the Ukrainians don't want to compromise on that. If you laid that territory out in Britain, it would cover the whole of England and Wales up to somewhere north of York. That's the amount of territory they've got. And so, of course, the Ukrainians are not going to give that up easily. And they are going to fight for it as long as they're able to fight. And as long as we are prepared to keep supporting Ukraine, all the indications are they'll keep fighting. So that's why this crisis is likely to keep spiralling upwards unless or until this crazy Putinist adventure, this imperialist adventure, is knocked on the head.
Here's one for you from Bill, and this is a question that's been asked almost since, I suppose, day one of the campaign. Given what we expected from the Russian Air Force, why haven't the Russians achieved complete air superiority, given the size of their Air Force? How come the Ukrainians are still holding out? They've still got their aircraft in the air?
They have, yeah. And this has been a surprise to all of us. And I can't give particularly definitive answers because we're all quite mystified by this. I mean, what air forces have to do in this situation is it's called SEAD, S-E-A-D, which is suppression of enemy air defences. And it's one of the terms of art. And so before a big operation, an air force will go through a SEAD operation, which might take several days. And what you're trying to do is knock out all the anti-aircraft and all the radars of the opposition so that the opposition is blind. And if they do get aircraft in the air, you'll be able to shoot them down quite quickly. And once you've got air superiority, even if you don't control the whole of the airspace, you control enough of it to protect your forces on the ground and help their offensives such as they are. That's what we did in Iraq, in Kuwait in 1991, in Iraq in 2003. Whatever the rights and wrongs of those operations were, they were textbook military operations in SEAD, suppression of enemy air defences, followed by ground forces. Why haven't the Russians done it? One is they seem not to have trained properly for it. They've got all the gear, they've got the kit to do it, but they don't seem to have trained because their Air Force, their Army and their Navy don't seem to work together very much. They're very undertrained. Even their real professionals, their pilots who are professional pilots, they're not conscripts. They only do about 100 hours a year in the cockpit, whereas most NATO pilots do well over 200 hours a year in the cockpit. So the pilots are less well trained, and they've shown no ability or even desire to create these, what we call them complex air operations, where you've got, electronic jamming aircraft flying above the battle zone, jamming things. You've got drones operating underneath, aircraft going in for particular targets, coordinating with the ground forces. They haven't done any of that. What they've done is rather like Second World War. They've had aircraft and drones operating just above their ground forces, bombing targets just ahead of their ground troops, as would have happened in 1943, 44, 45, but nothing more sophisticated. And yet, on paper, the Russians have got 4,000 aircraft. In reality, they've got more like 750, 800 that are really serviceable. And they committed about 350 of that 800 to this operation. And they've had very little real strategic effect. And what they're doing is that they're taking off from bases in Russia. They're just flying into Ukrainian territory. They're releasing their ordnance, their rockets or whatever it is, and then they're beetling back to their bases again. They're not spending any time over Ukrainian territory because they're so frightened of Ukrainian air defences, because one of the lessons of this conflict is how effective are ground-based anti-aircraft defences. All the things that we've seen, the javelins and the SAM missiles, the surface-to-air missiles, it has shown almost a real imbalance between effective, lethal things you can have on the ground that target aircraft and helicopters, and the ability of aircraft and helicopters to take them out, unless you go in for a very sophisticated SEAD operation. And so the Russians have found that they've struggled to make their air power count for something. And to be honest, we're still scratching our heads as to why they've got it so wrong.
Well, you've had a good stab at the answer, Michael. Thank you very much indeed for that. We're going to take a break. Still to come on this special Ukraine question and answer with Michael Clarke. We have the role of Belarus, potentially the role of Belarus, in the war in Ukraine.
I'm Hannah Thomas-Peter, and I'm Sky's climate change correspondent. The UK is a world leader in wind power. Power! Power! People! It's part of the Congo Basin rainforest, which is such an important ecosystem. It's known as the lungs of Africa.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. She doesn't really enjoy speaking to the press, and it wasn't clear right up until the last moment that she was going to sit down with me.
I might be just very naive, but I do believe that change is possible, otherwise we wouldn't be climate activists.
I'm confident for the last 30 years we have known how bad it is. I'm not here to apologize, I'm here to fight for the next step.
You can see just the piles and piles of stuff, these sofas and people's desks and children's books, and you can see inside this home here people trying to sort out their home. It's just been devastating.
I think everything's at stake. The future of our planet, the future of the beauty around us, the future of you and me.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.
Welcome back. More of your questions now about the war in Ukraine. Michael Clarke is with me as ever. So cracking on, Nick asks this. Do you think that Belarusian forces will attempt to attack Ukraine, given reports that they are on manoeuvres? Let's just explain to people, a close ally, of course, of Russia, and Russia had a lot of its forces in Belarus before it invaded Ukraine.
Yes, I mean, Belarus was the jumping-off place for the attempt to surround Kiev, certainly with one army group. I doubt if the Belarusians will move, to be honest. President Putin has obviously wanted them to, because he wanted Kazakhstan to send forces as well. He wanted to make this a joint operation among the Central Treaty states, the little sort of...
CTS, I mean,
CTS,
they pretend that's
Central
kind
Treaty
of Russian
Security
NATO.
Organization. That's right, it's a sort of a very pale version. And he wanted troops from all of those places to look as if it was a collective operation, and they all found reasons to say no. And Belarus, in particular, is deeply implicated in all of this because they've used their logistics to help the Russians. And they are conducting manoeuvres, and I would guess that Putin is telling Lukashenko, you know, get over the border and do something. The Ukrainians don't take it all that seriously because they've only got a sort of a reserve screening force opposite the Belarusians. The Ukrainians have got a very light force looking after that northwest border of theirs. Obviously, if the Belarusians did come across the border with armoured units, the Ukrainians would react, and that would be certainly a distraction to them. But at the moment, they're taking it very as a low-level threat, just with a screening force. And Lukashenko, I mean, he's described as Europe's last great dictator until Putin revealed himself in this guise. But Lukashenko, for all that's wrong with him, and there's an enormous amount wrong with him, he's a brutal, foolish, stupid man. However, he is quite good at reading the mood. He's survived a long time because he reads the mood. And a bit like Franco and Hitler. You know, I mean, Franco was a fascist dictator, and Hitler wanted Spain to join him in the Third Reich, and Franco always found reasons not to, even though he wanted Hitler to win and made common cause with him in every other respect. I think Belarus is rather the same. I think Lukashenko is trying to play for time to see what happens. And if Ukraine starts to collapse, then I think he'll walk in. You know, he'll take his share if Ukraine is... But whilst Ukraine is capable of fighting, I think he'll stay out of it.
Aren't there some reports of Belarusians, I mean, individually and collectively, joining Ukrainian forces, crossing the border to help out, not attack?
Yeah, I mean, the evidence is anecdotal, and you've got to be careful, you know, how much weight to put on anecdotal evidence, but there's quite a lot of it. that there are Ukrainian groups who are actually pro-Ukrainian, Belarusian groups who are pro-Ukrainian and have been sabotaging, which is a very dangerous thing to do in such a police state as Belarus, and are actively trying to prevent Belarus getting more involved. Because I think, as we've said before, as and when Putin falls, Lukashenko goes pretty well the next day.
Indeed. OK, well, listen, we're asking questions at this point then about neighbouring states to Ukraine. And this one, Toby says, should NATO place troops in mainland Moldova to deter any further Russian expansionist aims? So we've moved from Belarus to the north of Ukraine down to, what, the southwest?
Southwest, yeah. And this is almost exactly what our Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, said a couple of weeks ago, that we should be prepared to send troops to Moldova. I think if you look at Moldova on a map, that might seem a sensible thing to do, because Moldova is not a member of NATO. It's smallest and poorest state in Europe, pretty well. And it's obviously under threat from Russian troops they'd like to be in Odessa, and Odessa's only 30 miles away from the Moldova.
But aren't they already there in this breakaway called Transnistria?
Transnistria is a breakaway territory, follows the line of the Dniester River. It's the headquarters of the old 14th Army, the old Red Army 14th Army. There are about 500,000 people in Transnistria who claim to be Russians. They're Russian separatists. So about 500,000 in a state of about 4 million people, very small state. What's interesting, or what's difficult, is that the official Moldovan army is about 6,000 or 7,000 strong, the whole national army. The Transnistrian militias are about 10,000 strong, and there are 1,500 Russian so-called peacekeepers there, who the UN has told Russia to remove several times, and the Russians just ignore it. Add to which, 80% of all the electricity in Moldova is supplied by Transnistria, the breakaway republic. 100% of all the gas in the country is supplied by Russia, and the price of that gas has gone up by 400% this year. So essentially, Moldova is in a state of incipient collapse. And the president of Moldova, Mala Sandu, who's a pro-Western, pro-EU president, Putin hates her because she was properly elected for once, and she's trying to navigate her way through. If NATO troops turned up in Moldova, I'm convinced it would spark a civil war, and Moldova would fall apart, more or less immediately. The situation is so tense. And Moldova, they've done the only thing they could do. The day the Russians invaded, they applied to join the EU. And the EU immediately said, yes, of course, we'll start the process. They sent them a list of 366 questions to answer. And the Moldovans answered them within a couple of days. And the EU said, thank you very much. Have a look at this. And they sent them another 2,000 questions to answer. I mean, basically, the EU...
It's in the too difficult column.
Yeah. They just don't want to know. They're pretending to go through the process. But Moldova is a civil... I hate to say this, but it's true. It's a civil war just waiting to happen. And it will make everything that bit worse in the whole area of Ukraine. But I'd love to be wrong about the civil war.
Would there, or might there have been, an ultimate Russian ambition to extend its invasion of the south of Ukraine all the way through to join up with Transnistria and perhaps take Moldova? Sure.
If the Russians had got to Odessa, as they intended to a couple of months ago, and they haven't got close to Odessa yet, they're still well over 100 miles away, but if they got to Odessa, 30 more miles on, and they're at the border with Moldova. So at the point at which they captured Odessa, the Transnistrians almost certainly would have moved eastwards. They would have invaded the rest of Ukraine and declared themselves part of the Novorossiya, the new Russia, which is the Catherine the Great version of Russia, which Putin is trying to create.
OK, Michael, we've got another half an hour of this coming up. We've got to take a break now, and next we're going to be concentrating in more detail about the situation in and around Odessa, because we're going to be looking at the growing risk of food insecurity caused by the Russian blockade of Ukrainian ports. Welcome back. Now, Russia's ambassador to the United Nations walked out of a Security Council meeting yesterday. The ambassador objected to the European Council President, Charles Michel, criticising Russia about its blockade of Ukraine's port city of Odessa. Pressure is building for an international agreement to release the millions of tons of grain stuck in Ukraine, which many countries around the world rely on to feed their populations. Sky's international affairs editor Dominic Waghorn reports.
The war in Ukraine has come just as the world is being threatened by a global food supply crisis. Among the worst affected countries, Somalia, where drought and crop failure threaten a new famine.
Streams of people coming in still across, the dusty terrain. They're carrying all their possessions on their back. They've got kids and animals in tow. They are fleeing from the worst drought-affected areas.
Obviously, there are a number of factors leading to this crisis, but how much is Ukraine's war playing a role in this?
Food prices were already soaring due to livestock deaths, due to cereal crop failures. But the big concern now is that Ukraine is just going to exacerbate this, make it so much worse.
The war in Ukraine threatens to turn crisis into catastrophe for hundreds of millions globally who depend on its grain. Last year, its grain exports fed 400 million people worldwide. As we filmed in Ukraine last month, millions of tons are now trapped in the country. Its ports stand idle.
The world was already facing a food supply crisis, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine is making it much, much worse. With all these Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea now blocked, the UN is warning that 47 million more people will face acute hunger across the world if the war goes on. The latest UN hunger report has added Afghanistan and Somalia to its list of the highest alert countries described as facing catastrophic conditions. They're marked in red on this map. Those with deteriorating conditions include all of these countries in orange, including the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, Syria, and Kenya has just been added to the list because of its dependence on grain imports. These countries in yellow, like Sri Lanka, Zimbabwe, Angola, Lebanon, are described as areas of concern. Ukraine itself has now been added to that list for the first time because of what it's going through at the hands of Russia's invasion.
But Russia isn't bowing to mounting international criticism.
Let's be honest. The Kremlin is using food supplies as a stealth missile against developing countries.
Russia isn't just blockading Ukraine's ports, it's accused of stealing its grain too, caught on satellite loading it into ships in the ports it's occupied. Places like Kenya that depend on grain imports face soaring food prices on top of drought and crop failure. The mass suffering caused by the war in Ukraine is being exported far beyond its borders. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News.
Let's concentrate on grain then with Professor Michael Clarke here answering your questions about the war in Ukraine. This question comes from Gemma. And looking at that image that Dominic was just describing to us. And Gemma asks, Russia has been accused of looting grain. Can the cargo be intercepted and seized in international waters? Well, what do you think about that, Michael? It would be clearly seen as provocative by the Russians.
Well, not easily. At the moment, the grain tonnages, there's about 25 million tonnes piled up at Odessa. By the end of the summer, there'll be 75 million tonnes because the new harvest is coming in. And unless the present harvest gets moved, the new harvest will just sit or be unable to be moved. So we're talking about maybe 75 million tonnes. The Russians are accused by Ukraine, but also now by the United States, publicly and in the UN, of looting about 500,000 tonnes, about 500,000 tonnes, worth about $100 million, and loading it onto ships in Mariupol, some of which is back up and running now, and Berdyansk, which is still quite a functioning port. And what the Russians are accused of doing is taking these ships whose transponders are turned off, and so they get lost quite quickly, actually, once they're out of the Black Sea, and that the Russians are doing deals with African leaders to offer them grain at discount prices, and for political reasons, to give them support in the war. And of course, African leaders are saying, I don't care about the war, I just need the grain. And the United States is now calling the Russians out about this. Now, all of that is evil, and all of that is completely morally wrong. Legally, could you actually intercept a ship at sea? Well, you could only really do that if there's some legal basis. That is some resolution from the UN or from another regional organisation. NATO might be able to provide that because this is still Europe. But you'd have to have a resolution. You'd have to have good evidence that that particular ship, with its transponders turned off, loaded grain from Berdyansk, which was grain that was stolen from the silos in wherever in Ukraine, in occupied Ukraine, like Melitopol or wherever it might have been. You need a trail of evidence in order to have the legal justification to stop and board.
But can that? I mean, you say the transponders are turned off, but you know we've got the satellite images there. I mean, presumably the United States and others can just keep the satellites going and track the ship its entire way.
I'll tell you, people in the Navy say to me, you'd be amazed how easily ships can get lost in the seas if they don't want to be found. It's remarkably difficult to find them or to track them all the time. You really need a lot of intelligence assets, you know, partly based around the ship or people who can see the ship and so on. Even using satellite imagery, the shipping lanes are so complex. And a lot of ships turn their transponders off because they're playing games with cargoes being dropped off at different places, not necessarily illegally, but they don't want the competitors to know, and they drop something off somewhere they weren't due to, and then they go on to where they were due to go. There's an awful lot of dark edges, as it were. I mean, what happens in the maritime sphere is like the front row of a rugby scrum, to be honest. Only those who do it really know what's happening.
Good analogy, the dark arts there. But, well, we've got another question then about grain, and not then about tracking the ships, but about escorting the ships. And this issue of Odessa and all that grain that Dominic was describing, stored there, millions upon millions of tons. Why can't NATO warships escort grain convoys into and out of Odessa and dare the Russians to attack?
That's what they have to do. If there was an international agreement, and Turkey was part of it, to allow ships through the Bosphorus, because, as we've said many times before, Turkey controls the Bosphorus legally. So if there were an international agreement between those powers who were going to operate the ships, Turkey, the warships that would escort them, and the Russians agreed that they would not interfere with these ships, then we'd be daring the Black Sea Fleet to get involved. But we're a long way away from that at the moment. There's no chance in present circumstances that President Putin would agree to this, given that he's taking a backdoor route to, as it were, stealing the grain. And also, remember, the Russian grain is pretty plentiful. The Russians have had a good harvest this year for just climatic reasons, and Europe and the United States have had a poor harvest. That's just the accident of climate. So the Russians have got a good harvest, and they've got the grain they're taking from Ukraine, and they're doing their own backdoor deals. And they'll continue, in my view, to do that until somebody really puts a stop to it. So convoys in and out of Odessa are feasible technically, politically, very hard to imagine.
Well, we all know the effects of food shortages politically, economically. We've seen it in Sri Lanka at the moment. We saw it back in 2011, of course, a major factor in the Arab Spring. And this question from Andy addresses that, because he says Putin has effectively declared war against the whole world by blocking the export of essential food. Surely the world should join the battle then against the Russian invasion through a UN mandate. Discuss.
Yeah, well, UN mandate through the Security Council is impossible because Russia is one of the permanent members and can veto it. And if for some reason Russia, unaccountably didn't veto it, China would. So you've got 2 out of the 5 members who would stop it happening. The way you might get UN resolutions through the General Assembly, and that's been used as a mechanism before. But remember, the General Assembly met on the 2nd of March, not long after the invasion, to condemn Russia. And the results were 141 nations condemned Russia and 35 nations didn't. 35 nations abstained and 5 nations voted for Russia, including Russia. You know, Russia and 4 allies, like Syria and North Korea, the basket cases. So essentially it was 141 against 40. That seems pretty decisive. But those 40 nations who either voted for Russia or who abstained still represented politically more than half of the world's population. And so the fact is that the rest of the world is still waiting to see what happens, is not as morally outraged by this war as we are in the West, and are waiting to be convinced that the West not only has got something to offer, but is going to prevail. And so, all that Andy says, I think, could be true, but the Americans are working very hard at the UN to try to bring on board these 35 nations who abstained, including China and India, big nations, to bring them on board with the idea that, look, we can't allow this to continue. The world is going to suffer in all sorts of ways way outside Europe. Food insecurity is only one of the ways we might suffer. And you've really got to start to make a decision on this. Get on board with the Western powers who are going to try to put this right.
And can I ask you a question, continuing about this, Michael, in terms of the war aims of Putin? As we discussed before, the original aim was to take the whole of Ukraine, certainly Kiev and its major cities within a few days. Of course, we saw what went wrong with that. Is this then part of its evolving tactics? They've realised it was never an original aim. They've realised the power of restricting the grain and the food supply.
I think that's arisen, my own view, it's arisen accidentally because the Russians didn't think it would go on this long. Given that it has gone on this long, suddenly they find that they've got, it's a dilemma, but it's also a weapon for them. It's another sort of tool of extortion in a way, or tool of pressure that they can use on other countries, on the West. And the narrative that they are creating, and this is believed, I mean, privately, I'm hearing reports out of New York that, within ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that people are going along with the Russian narrative saying, look, this food crisis is created by Western sanctions. And the food crisis is because the Russians are only responding to NATO rather than NATO responding to Russia. And so the Russians are having some success in convincing the uncommitted in Asia and parts of Africa that it's a 50-50 moral issue. It's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. And for that reason, the Americans and the rest of the Europeans have got to work really hard in trying to get this idea through to everybody that what the Russians did has got to be regarded as unacceptable in a civilized, law-abiding world, which is what it's not civilized, it's not law-abiding, but it's better than anything else at the moment, and it will only get worse if we tolerate yet another Russian land grab, which will be the third Russian land grab against Ukraine in 8 years.
Extremely concerning. Michael, for the time being, thank you very much indeed. You're watching a Sky News question and answer special. Coming up, we're going to be discussing the possible end game for that conflict in Ukraine.
And it's moving this way.
And over there is Dover.
We track the changes happening to our world right now.
I think it's a procession of the Taliban. There they are, right here.
Would you, as Prime Minister, be able to look them in the face?
Let's have a look at both of those two things.
I just want to say thank you for having the courage to speak to us.
We do genuinely believe in what we do, to show the truth.
I thought there was an astonishing story there.
Welcome back. Professor Michael Clarke is here answering your questions about the war in Ukraine. And, Michael, we've got several questions now about the state of the battle or battles. And this from Rudiger. At what point will Ukraine be able to launch massive counterattacks against the Russian invasion? I suppose to some extent it is in places, but this is tactical now. It's cat and mouse.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, they've launched a lot of tactical counterattacks, some of which have been extremely successful, and it looks as if they're having some success in Kharkiv in the north and Kherson in the south. But these are local counterattacks which show good command and some very good soldiering. A strategic counteroffensive, which is I think what Rudiger is probably talking about, that's a different kettle of fish altogether. Because to do that, the Ukrainians will need different equipment. They need a lot more armour, they need a great deal more artillery and multiple launch rocket systems that we were talking about early on. They then have to reform themselves. Instead of operating in small units, they've then got to be able to operate in bigger units. And, of course, the bigger units can't come together and sort of sit around in concentrations because they become huge targets then for Russia's missiles. So they've got to have enough mobility to be separated, but then come together really quickly to form a concentration to punch through at a certain place. Organising a strategic offensive is a really different issue to organising a dynamic defence, which is what they've done so far. And in the Donbass at the moment, they're caught in between but they're doing something in between the two. It's not quite dynamic defence, and it's certainly not strategic offensive, but they're conducting a conventional fallback operation to preserve as much as possible. So when would they be able to do it? Well, not until, I'm guessing, toward the end of this year, and if they get quite a lot more help and equipment from the West. They haven't got the sort of equipment yet in sufficient numbers to do it, which means that this war, I'm sure, unless the Ukrainians give up or are prevailed to give up before then, will go into next year.
Well, if they get to that point, Anthony's question follows on from that. Anthony asks, why is it considered unacceptable for Ukraine to attack legitimate military targets in Russia? I mean, hopefully they push the Russians out and keep going.
Well, it would be very foolish of the Ukrainians to go anywhere past their own borders, because this is a war to recover their own territory from a foreign...
But I suppose that means also missile strikes.
There are legitimate military targets the other side of the border. I mean, Russian air bases, which are just, 50 or 60 miles the other side of the border. And a lot of areas around Belgorod, for instance, or Kursk, scene of a famous battle in the Second World War. Lots of stuff there which would make military sense for the Ukrainians to attack. However, the Ukrainians would risk losing a lot of political support if it looked as if they were attacking on Russian territory. And, of course, it would give Mr. Putin exactly the justification for saying, you see why we had to attack Ukraine? You see why we had to do what we did? They want to attack us directly and murder our people. So the Ukrainians have got to play this very carefully. In a way, they've got to give the Russian territory the status of safe haven.
We've got the unthinkable question now, but of course it is being thought and expressed by the Russians. Leighton asks this. How would NATO be likely to respond to the use of a tactical nuclear weapon by the Russians? What do you think?
I can promise you that NATO is thinking about this all the time, gaming it out. And so are the Americans in their Tiger team, as they call it. My own view is that if it were a tactical nuclear weapon used on the battlefield, then the response would just be a great deal more of the same as what we're doing. If, and this gets into the area of really bizarre speculation, but this is where we are, if the Russians were to sort of take a Hiroshima option, say, and attack a Ukrainian city in order to say, we'll keep doing this, every couple of days until you give in, that's basically what the Allies did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If they were to do that, or if they were somehow to use a nuclear weapon that affected the West, to put one in the water at sea, to create a tsunami, to actually swamp Allied ships or something like that. I mean, you can frighten yourself with all of these ideas. I think that the reaction would be very different. And I suspect that what the West would be thinking about then, it's only my view, nobody's told me this, would be some sort of massive conventional campaign against Russia's tactical nuclear infrastructure, to actually hit very hard the infrastructure that creates these tactical weapons or the sort of weapons that they're using. But that would be very dangerous. And I would say if NATO ends up in a situation where it feels it has to do that, then it really better mean it. It really better mean it and do it fully and properly and take the risk. But we're not nearly in that situation yet.
Exactly. OK, we've got a couple more questions, and this is towards the end game. This one is from Brian. Even if Russia captures all of the Donbass, would they be able to hold it long term? I suppose the more territory they take, the more they're extended.
Yeah, exactly. They've got 20% of Ukraine at the moment. They'd have real trouble holding it. There are millions of people who live there who've demonstrated again and again that they don't want to live under Russian occupation. There's quite a lot of insurrection in other places, in Melitopol, for instance, and in Kherson. There are already partisans who are beginning to spring up. Partisan groups have been training since 2014. They've been trained by the special forces of Ukraine. They've been taken into Ukraine's defence structure. So the Ukrainians are ready for a sort of a constant civil war. So, would the Russians be able to hold it long term? Not without a great deal of trouble. It would drain them constantly unless they resorted to absolute, complete terror, and the rest of the world would be watching.
OK, endgame. This from Andy, and we ask it every week we do these, but of course every week I suppose there's a different way of looking at it. Andy says, can this possibly end with a negotiated settlement given the irreconcilable views of each side? And it is thought, isn't it, that particularly the French and the Germans, although they say they're not, they've had these conversations individually and collectively with President Putin, that they would like to see some kind of ceding of territory and this ended as quickly as possible.
And Henry Kissinger has said it, and the New York Times is coming up with arguments about a negotiated settlement. I think the only negotiation there would be is a negotiated pause, a negotiated truce. But it wouldn't settle it because we know that Putin wants to erase Ukraine from the map. And even if he gives up on that, the world and the Western world should not agree to the idea that this nouveau Russia, this imperialist adventure of his to take as much of Ukraine as he can get in the pursuit of some, 18th century version of Russia, that we should somehow acquiesce in that is wrong. And the Ukrainians certainly won't acquiesce in it.
But realistically, can you see, for instance, Russia being militarily ejected from the Crimea?
Not the Crimea. There are good reasons why they wouldn't be ejected from the Crimea. And I think Crimea will remain Russian, as it was until 1953, when Crimea was given by Stalin to Ukraine for slightly strange reasons. So the Crimea is different, but the rest of Ukraine, the area of the Donbass, the area of the so-called land bridge, the area around Kherson and Mariupol and Mykolaiv, Odessa, all of that is thoroughly Ukrainian. And, what President Zelensky keeps saying, and he's much more flexible, or sounds more flexible than Putin on this, he said, look, when you leave my country, we can talk. But I'm not going to talk until you leave my country. And what he means by leave my country is go back to where you were before the 24th of February, which is not entirely leaving the country. Zelensky is a lot more flexible than he sounds when you look at what he says. But he's basically saying, until this invasion is reversed, we cannot talk.
But hearing that means then that Putin has it in his power to split the Western alliance. If he makes some kind of territorial offer, particularly keeping that land bridge you mentioned to Crimea,
I think he will.
Then, what are the Germans and the French and others going to say?
If he takes the whole of the Donbass, and he's a long way from doing that yet, he's probably going to get Luhansk, but not the whole of Donetsk, the bigger portion of the Donbass. But if he takes the whole of the Donbass, let's say in the next month or 6 weeks, then I think he'll offer a truce or some sort of peace deal, a Minsk III, and he'll split the Western alliance by sweet-talking us. And that, politically, is a very disturbing prospect. It's what we used to call appeasement.
Michael, let's bring it down now to what wars really are about, which is the human level, the human suffering on such a grand scale. We've got a picture. Just before we finish, I want to show you a picture, a powerful image from Ukraine. This is a young woman returning to the wreckage of her now destroyed school, as you can see. That's in her beautiful prom dress on the day the dance was supposed to take place. What a picture. The story posted on Facebook by the Ukrainian government comes from Anna Episheva. She shared an image of her niece in that red gown. Goodness knows how she kept it in such a wonderful state. Michael, as I say, it comes down to the human level, doesn't it? And the contrast there between the dress, the beauty, and the utter devastation behind her. That puts it all into perspective.
It does. Dermot, in the First World War, for every soldier, or at least 10 soldiers died in the First World War for every civilian across Europe who died. 10 soldiers for every civilian. In modern war, it's exactly the other way around. 10 civilians die for every soldier who dies. That's the way modern warfare is. Because warfare is always about people. It's those people who are trained in uniform and they're trained to kill people and break things. That's what they do. That's their fundamental rationale. And other people who they are there to protect. The purpose of the military is to protect those who are weaker than them. That's the idea. But it comes down to people, the willpower of the soldiers and the willpower of civilians. And always,
they're the ones
it comes down to real people. real people.
Michael, thank you so much for a really insightful session, particularly that thought to close. This has been a special Q&A session on the war in Ukraine. Coming up in the next hour, could drivers soon be paying £2 for a litre of petrol? Stay with us.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.